What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to be diving into 10 cards that I do feel like will become a problem in the post-rotation standard when that happens. Overall, each of these cards are kind of showing the signs of being like a frustrating, if not, problematic card in the sense that you kind of get the gist of kind of where the deck is going to go once you kind of see a particular card pop out onto the battlefield. Some of these cards, it's definitely one of those things that's going to be early to tell if these cards will still stay relevant come into post-rotation standard, just because we won't know what new cards we're going to get after September. So it's definitely one of those things that, it definitely time will tell, and it'll be one of those interesting things that when I do probably the video about 10 cards leaving standard next year, it'll definitely be interesting if these cards still make the list. So it's definitely one of those things that I do kind of want to see what happens as we kind of get through next year of a post-rotation standard, and kind of see what cards are going to be overall problematic overall throughout the whole year of the next standard. So the first card up on the list is definitely a card that I think has seen a lot more play more recently, especially in more aggro decks, and this is more of an honorary mention. I do have two of those in this video as well before we dive into the top 10, and that card's going to be Kamano Faces of Kakazan. It's a card that I feel like it's one of those things that I feel like every aggro deck that is going to be splashed in red will play this card on turn 1. It's actually a very strong card in the sense that not only on turn 1 you're going to deal 1 damage to target player, if not a planeswalker, if they somehow have one on turn 1. The fact is that you keep on getting value out of this card after that first initial turn. So on chapter 2 of the saga, you're now going to be getting whatever creature you play on turn 2 will also have a +1/+1 counter. We kind of saw this with the Boros aggro deck, and this is kind of why the Boros aggro deck was so dominant, in the sense that it has this card, and it kind of makes your 2-drop not on top of it that much stronger. If it's a haster, you're now swinging and possibly for 3. Which is definitely pretty good. Even made Luminarch Aspirant, for example, in current standard, a 3/3 on turn 2, which is definitely pretty powerful and definitely gets out of the way of a lot of removal. It's except for like direct removal. So definitely, an interesting card that I do see a lot of play. That probably will see a lot of play, especially in aggro decks that play red in some form or manner. And then on top of that, on the third chapter, on turn 3, if you have other creatures on the battlefield, you're also going to get a free creature that's a 2/2 that whenever a source you control will deal damage would kill a creature or destroy a creature. It will get exiled instead of going to the graveyard. So definitely a card that's going to have a lot of value. Yet again, for only being an uncommon, this is one of those cards that kind of already are sticking out to be kind of that card. Not really super problematic, but it's definitely one of those cards that you'll just see a bunch of, and you'll just get kind of sick of. No one kind of like, if your opponent's playing this, they're more than likely deck X. So that's definitely one of the reasons why this is going to be an honorable mention. And like I said, time will really tell if this card's going to be as prevalent as it is currently in standard. But I do see this card being very good for just being 1 mana overall. Now, the next card up on the list is kind of like one of those cards that I'm unsure of how good it's going to become a post-rotation standard, but I do see that it having a lot of viability in a lot of decks, in the sense that it does have a lot of good value, especially in like the mono green decks, or even decks that like to take a lot of value from putting things in graveyard and getting them back. And that card is going to be Shigeki Jukai Visionary. It's another good card that I do think it has a lot of value, as you can tap double X and double green, and you definitely can return X target non-legendary cards back from the graveyard to your hand by channeling it, which gets around any sort of removal or counter spells, I should say. And in itself, it's a creature that is a 1/3 for 2 mana that you can tap to, return it back to your hand, look at the top 4 cards of your library, reveal a land card among them, put on the battlefield, tap them, put the rest into your graveyard. So there's a lot of good value with this card, and I do think it's going to be one of those cards that this is going to be, I have a weird feeling that you're going to see a lot of decks that maybe play like a Golgari deck or something like that, play Shigeki, and maybe play cards like Invoke Despair, to get multiple triggers of Invoke Despair to happen in the game. And Shigeki is kind of one of those other problematic cards, in the sense that it's still kind of too early to tell if a deck like a Golgari style deck, or a deck that just has a lot of cards in graveyard that you want to return back with Shigeki, to really see how dominant he'll be in the next standard. But it's definitely a card that I do think the reason why it's kind of like an annoying card is the sense that it is kind of like, unless you're playing some sort of graveyard hate, this card's going to get a lot of value out of, the player's going to get a lot of value who's playing this card. And it's definitely one of those things that it's kind of like you'll see it face up, like, your opponent says go, you go, do stuff, and then all of a sudden your opponent has all this mana open and they didn't do anything. You're like, well, more than likely if they're playing green, they may be setting up a Shigeki turn. You start seeing them pile through the graveyard, picking out what they want, and all of a sudden they get back 4 cards that can invoke Despair and stuff like that, and they get a bunch of value without having to really, do a lot. Whether they've already cast those spells or those cards end up in the graveyard in one way or another. It's definitely going to be a card to kind of wait and see. Still early to tell. It is in the honorable mentions, but yet again, it's kind of an interesting card that I do think it's going to be one of those cards that you'll see kind of pop up whenever you see an opponent possibly playing green. So definitely a card to kind of keep an eye out on and see how, how much it goes up in the meta as a whole. But definitely a card that will be frustrating over time. Now, the next card up on the list is another card that, like, I feel like it sees play here and there, but it's, it's not definitely a main board card in most decks that play it, and it's going to be Lear, Disciple of the Drowned. It's a card that I feel like has seen play sporadically through the current standard ever since it's been released, but I feel like in a weird way, once we kind of get some of the cards that kind of target these monocolored creatures out of the way, it's definitely going to be a card that's going to be definitely very prevalent. Yet again, just like Shigeki, it's a card that gets a lot of value from things into your graveyard, allowing you to cast spells from your graveyard as though they had flashback, which is definitely a very strong ability. You get, things like Fate and Hope back from the graveyard, possibly draw spells back from the graveyard. So it's a card that can get a lot of value. With the one downside is that if you're a mono blue deck or a deck that is like an Azorius deck, maybe like an Azorius control deck, you can't counter any spells, but I think for the trade-off of getting extra value out of your spells that would be in your graveyard, I do think it's going to be one of those cards that, with it being like the kind of at the tail end of my list, it's definitely one of those things that if you don't yet again have a way to kind of get rid of things in a graveyard, it's definitely going to be a very problematic card just because I do think we lose a lot of good removal for it. And you can probably see it pop up a lot more in these said control decks and decks that maybe even play blue or play spells. Even let's just say like a mono blue tempo style deck, you can see Lear pop up in there because now it gives you all your kind of cantrippy kind of spells extra value because once they go in the graveyard, you can then recast them again. And then kind of like, with those decks, it's a lot of like you're trying to possibly play like the blue march to kind of, phase things out. And then essentially, discard in blue spells that you can then eventually replay back with Lear. It's definitely going to be a card that, like I said, it's going to see some play. It's definitely kind of like Luris, getting extra value back from the graveyard is definitely a good thing. And it's one of those things that it's, you can, as long as you can cast these spells, you can play as many as you want on your turn or even your opponent's turn. So it's definitely a card that has that value as well, at the downside of not being able to counter or anything. And like I said, as we see the meta develop, we'll kind of see if Lear kind of makes its dent in the meta. We do lose a lot of like kind of cheapy kind of spells that you may have outside of like maybe a couple things that would be in blue like Fate and Hope. But yet again, it's another card that I do think that it will see a lot of play in some way or another, whether it's control or maybe in some sort of tempo style deck. So the next card up on the list is another card that is kind of like a little bit of a newer card, but I do think it's going to be a card that's going to be, yet again, a lot better in a post-rotation standard just because it is a very, very good card because of what you get out of it. And that card's going to be Titan of Industry. It's a 7-mana, 7/7 Reach Trampler that when it comes to the battlefield, you can choose to. You can destroy target artifact, you can gain 5 life, you create a 4/4 Rhino creature token, and on top of it, you can put a shield counter on target creature control. Now, I do know that you can technically target it before, let's just say you put a shield counter on it, you can target with like a spot removal spell, and then, avoid it getting that shield counter, and then the shield counter fizzles out, but they still get like whatever else they chose. But yet again, it's another card that is just very big that once it kind of gets out, it kind of changes the game up a little bit. And there's actually another card on the list that if you get this out plus the other card, this is definitely a card that kind of takes over the game just because, if you're able to crank out 7/7 Reach Tramplers that get double these effects every time they come out on the battlefield, it's definitely like a game changer just because, gaining 5 chunks of life at a time or creating 4/4 Rhino creature tokens, just getting a very wide board very, very quickly, definitely can put a lot of pressure on your opponent. And yet again, it really just needs some sort of direct removal or some sort of board wipe really to get rid of it once it's already out on the battlefield. But overall, it's a very, very good card. It is a card that, like I said, I think we'll see a lot of play in like your top end decks that are looking to play these more expensive spells. So yet again, another card that I do think is that it's going to be very powerful. And it's definitely one of those cards that when you see it kind of like come out of the battlefield, it's like, okay, I really need to find an answer or the game's essentially over. So definitely a card that's going to be very dominant, I think, for the meta, even with whatever we do get in a post-rotation standard. Now, the next card up, just like the Titan of Industry, the next card up is going to be Hullbreaker Horror, and it's a 7-drop 7/8 that has flash, so you can cast it at the end of your opponent's turn. The spell can't be countered, so if you're playing like a mirror matchup or a control matchup, they can't counter it directly. And the reason why I feel like I'm not really a big fan of this card is that, yet again, it's one of those things that are, once it's out on the battlefield, and if they have open mana deck, they do have a castable spell with it. Essentially, you kind of get this effect that it has a built-in counter spell / a built-in bounce spell. And the card itself, as long as you can kind of keep that momentum going and be able to bounce things and kind of keep your hand of things that can, keep things bouncing back to your opponent's hand, or spells getting back, your opponent casts mana for a spell. It's definitely one of those cards that is definitely, it's hard to remove once it's out, especially if your opponent has mana open to protect it. Yet again, it's a very good card with it being able to have flash. It's a 7/8, so it's definitely very large as well. Your opponent casts at the end of their turn, they untap, they have all this mana open now to essentially protect it as long as they have spells in their hand. It's just going to be one of those problematic cards that once they kind of cast it, it's definitely going to be hard to remove. Also, to kind of note here, yet again, I kind of maybe should have mentioned it with Delir, but this is yet again one of those cards that they nerfed in alchemy and kind of changed it up. I think they got rid of the ability that it can't be countered, but I think it still does essentially the same exact thing, which I guess is kind of like a nerf because it kind of makes it more susceptible to other control decks. But yet again, it's a very strong card. It does a lot of good things that once it keeps itself on the battlefield, and when we kind of get rid of that monocolored exile kind of effect for 2 mana, it's definitely going to be a card that's going to be hard to remove if your opponent has mana open to protect it. So the next card up on the list, this is going to be one of those cards that I do think is going to see a lot more play because of how good it is for only 2 mana. And I think you kind of see that in other formats of Magic. And that card's going to be Ledger Shredder. It's a 2 mana 1/3 flyer that whenever you or your opponent casts a second spell on a turn, you get to connive, which is draw a card and discard a card from your hand. And if you discarded a non-land card, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on Ledger Shredder. Combine this with having multiples of these out on a turn, or you play some sort of like mono blue tempo deck, or maybe a Azorius tempo deck, or a deck that just kind of plays blue in some sort of way. Ledger Shredder is definitely going to be a card that kind of taxes not only your opponent and you get kind of like card advantage, but yet again, if you are able to cast multiple spells in your turn, it's a card that definitely takes a lot of advantage of casting multiple spells. And the fact that it is a 1/3 flyer that with the possibility of having extra mana open, or your opponent has to play a second spell really to kind of keep up with what's happening in the game, you get a lot of value out of it as well. It's going to be one of those cards I do think you're going to see it be played quite often if your opponent's playing some sort of blue, whether it's maybe more of a tempo style deck or something like that. But yet again, it's another great card. I actually think it's a pretty fair card for the most part, but I just think it's a lot of value for only being 2 mana. And it's kind of surprising that they made it a rare, but overall it's an interesting card, and I do think it's gonna be one of those cards you'll see a lot of play of. I do think I could see like a mono blue Delver style deck playing Ledger Shredder, and a lot of things to phase things out, like slip out the back, march, and stuff like that. It's not gonna be one of those decks to kind of watch out for the most part, come in a post rotation standard. And this is going to be one of those key cards that kind of helps that deck perform a lot better than it possibly could without it. So definitely going to be a good card. I do think it's going to be problematic in the sense that you're going to see it a lot if the deck is going to be really good. But overall, it's a very good card for 2 mana. So the next card up on this list is going to be Wedding Announcement. And I think this is actually like a really, really good card for what it does, because I do think cards that get extra value after they play them, regardless, I think with these additional triggers, then on top of it has like a final ability. So essentially, as much as it's an enchantment, it's actually just a saga built in like a paragraph. But it's a 3 mana enchantment that, every turn that if you don't attack with 2 creatures, you get to put a 1/1 vampire creature or 1/1 white human creature token on the battlefield. If you attack with 2 or more creatures in a turn, you draw a card instead. On the 3rd time you do this, it actually gets a counter on it, and then all creatures you control get +1/+1. So this card is definitely going to have a lot of value, and it's going to be one of those cards that I do think you'll see in a lot of decks, not just aggro decks. You'll probably see it in control decks, just because it's a way to kind of make their things that much bigger, because typically these decks don't play a lot of creatures. So they either play this to kind of get some creature presence on the battlefield, so if they need jump blockers. And then towards the tail end of the game, once they kind of have that control, every creature they have, it comes down the battlefield, it's just that one more bigger, and if they have multiples of these out, it could be 1 or 2 more bigger, if not more. Yet again, it's going to be one of those cards that you'll just see a ton of, and I just think that's kind of why it kind of makes the list. And we'll kind of see how the meta shifts and shakes up, but it's definitely one of those cards that I do, you see a lot in like Esper Control. You see it just kind of pop up here and there. I think like Orzhov Control or Orzhov is another deck that this pops up in. And like I said, it's a very good card for 3 mana. I'm not saying it's like super broken. It's just a card that you just see a ton of. And it's kind of like with the lit cards before it. All these cards are kind of like, they're good cards, but yet again, we really don't know how good they will be in a post-rotation standard. This is kind of like the last of those before we get into the final few. And this is kind of one of those, cards that has a lot of value. But if you really, prevent your opponent from keeping those creatures on the battlefield, or they don't have a bunch of creatures, the card's not really overall that powerful. But yet again, it's definitely going to be a card I do think a lot of people are going to play to kind of really try to take advantage of in one way or the other. So now we're getting kind of into like the meat of this list of cards that I do think, I'm just in general to me are just not really that fun. And the first card up is going to be Invoke Despair, and it's a 5 mana. Target opponent sacrifices a creature. If they can't, they lose to life, and you draw a card. And this also repeats for an enchantment and a planeswalker. And the reason why I'm not a big fan of this card is that, you know, for 5 mana, that's a lot of value because it's a 5 mana, possibly draw up to 3 cards. Your opponent has to possibly sacrifice 3 different things, and they also lose a possibility of up to 6 life. And combine this with, like, say, a Shigeki or something like that, you know, having your opponent be able to do this multiple times. It's definitely very, like, you know, it definitely can change the momentum of a game because, you know, typically a deck that could counteract it may be playing those other things. And if you're sacrificing that enchantment you may have just played last turn, that's maybe a Saga. You sacrifice that Planeswalker, and now you have to sacrifice possibly a creature. And if you don't have, like, a really crappy creature, you could be sacrificing one of your big creatures. And if you don't do any of those, your opponent's not only getting, you know, they're getting card advantage. You're also losing 6 life. It's definitely going to be a card that once you kind of play it, it's kind of like yet again kind of one of those things. And I do think it's going to be one of those things you'll see a lot more of, just because like the mono black decks and things like that, they're losing things like Blood on the Snow. I do think this is possibly a card that this card will really fill in those mono black decks if it hasn't already. Yet again, it's just a very good card. It has a lot of power for only being 5 mana. Sure, it's a quadruple black, which makes it harder to cast in other decks. But we've seen in current standard that people find ways to play it in multicolor decks, not just 2 colors, but I've even seen people play it in 3-color decks. So it's definitely a card that if you can find ways to build for it, you can definitely play it in those decks. So yet again, a very, very good card. Being only 5 mana, being only rare as well, makes it definitely very good as well. But overall, yet again, a very, very good card that I do think that after a couple months of the next standard, you'll be sick of pretty quickly. So the next card up on the list is kind of another interesting card here, and you're probably wondering where maybe certain cards are, and it's possibly that they're still on the list to be announced. But the next card up is going to be Brutal Cathar. This is going to be one of those cards that, because Mono White has been so popular for so long, and you know Mono White was popular before rotation happened last year, and essentially this came out right when rotation happened and kind of just took a spot in that Mono White deck when rotation happened. It's a card you've seen a ton of play of, not only in Mono White but now Boros Aggro. I think it's in like Esper as well. It's just a very good card that kind of works like a apparition, but you know it's not as good in the sense that it can't take things that aren't non-creatures, but it's definitely very good because it can eat tokens, because that's the one thing that apparition can't do. So you can put a token underneath it. The token now essentially dies from being taken by the Brutal Cathar. It does have the thing that if it goes from the daybound nightbound cycle multiple times, you can put multiple things underneath it. If it's on the nightbound side, in order to target it, you have to pay 3 life. So it's definitely a card that is very good in what it does. For being only 3 mana and being a rare, it definitely was a card that really filled a good role in like a mono white deck or even the Boros aggro deck. Just because, you know, when you're like on the play or on the draw, it's definitely a much better card on the play, especially in best of 1. Just because, you know, you kind of can be you kind of be the aggressor, and this card helps you be that much more aggressive because your opponent could play a creature on turn 2 that could block, but now you're eating it with a Brutal Cathar, and now you're still swinging it for a bunch of damage. It's just a card like I said, we've already seen it for we've already seen it pretty much the whole past year, and we still have to deal with a whole nother year of it. And like, you know what, the thing is, as much as mono white, it's not going to be as good as maybe it has been. I still think there will be mono white decks. There'll still be Boros aggro decks. There'll still be probably human decks currently out there. And this is definitely one of those cards you'll see in that 3-drop slot just because of how good it is. It does a lot of things. It's essentially like it's a creature that is also like an Oblivion Ring or an exile effect like an enchantment would typically do. So definitely one of those cards that, you know, when your opponent slams it or you slam it, it's definitely a card that can really shake up that early game and kind of set you up for success. But overall, very, very good card. And, you know, I'm already kind of over it as is. But yet again, we still have a whole another year until this set rotates out. So definitely a card that I'm not looking forward to facing. So the next card up on the list is going to be Fable of the Mirror Breaker. It's a 3-mana enchantment that's a saga that it comes out. You get a 2/2 goblin creature token that whenever it attacks, you get a treasure token. And then in Chapter 2, you get to discard up to 2 cards. And you can draw that many cards. And then Chapter 3, you get the Kiki Jiki Mirror Breaker creature that is a 2/2 that you can pay 1 mana and tap it, and you get to copy target non-legendary creature and sacrifice at the end of your turn, or at the end of your turn. And this is kind of that card that you'll see in a lot of red decks, just because it's a very good 3-drop, because it has a lot of cards that have additional value than just the initial enter the battlefield kind of thing. And Sagas are a really good card of that. Is that even though on turn 1 you only get a 2/2, that turn 2 now can attack in even into creatures that could kill it in the process, give you an additional mana. On top of that, chapter 2 allows you to kind of dig a little bit deeper, get rid of maybe cards that you don't really need in your hand that aren't good against the matchup, and find possible answers. And then chapter 3, if that Kiki Jiki creature can stay on the battlefield at least for a turn until it loses summon sickness, that Kiki Jiki essentially turns all your creatures into like better cards. So you see it with like Titan of Industry on this list. If you're able to tap that creature, get an extra copy of Titan of Industry, you're now getting like shield token, you're getting a 4/4, you're possibly destroying artifacts, you're possibly getting chunks of life, and that creature also has haste, so it attacks in immediately. So you're getting a lot of value out of this card. And I do think it's one of those cards that you kind of see this, it's kind of like, yeah, it's another like Psy thing. But I mean, it's one of those things that, I do think cards like Sagas have kind of, they're a lot of value, even though like their initial value may not be a lot for what you get out of it. It is susceptible to removal, though not many decks really play direct enchantment removal. So it is one of those things that typically you'll probably get off chapter 1 and 2. And then chapter 3 is the one that, once it flips over to the creature, that's probably where they can spot remove it because it can be the creature. So it's a little bit more vulnerable. It's only a 2-drop, or it's only a 2/2 creature. But yet again, if that creature sticks and you have another good creature to kind of copy with it, it's definitely a card that, yet again, transforms the game in general. I mean, you can even copy it, the enchantment itself, the creature enchantment itself, and make multiple copies at the end of your opponent's turn. Those creatures now untap, and then you get to swing in with those creatures. So it's definitely, yet again, another one of those things that I do think that you'll see a lot of play. It's kind of like, I feel like it's that staple red card that you'll see in a lot of red decks that play some sort of red, just because there's a lot of value in it. Not only is it helps you ramp a little bit, it helps you kind of fix your hand a little bit, and the fact that if you have something that's worthy of copying, chapter 3 is definitely good as well. So definitely overall a card that is just going to be one of those things that's you're going to see a ton of play of, and it's just going to become frustrating just because of the overexposure of how many decks will probably play this card just because of how much value it does give. Next card up on the list, this is going to be another card that I do think is very, very good. And that card is going to be the Wandering Emperor. It's a 4-mana Planeswalker that has Flash, which is already pretty good. And you're able to use its ability the turn it comes down the battlefield. So if you play it on the end of your opponent's turn or in response to your opponent attacking, you're able to use one of her loyalty abilities and essentially, do something, either put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. It gains first strike. So if you have a creature out on the battlefield, you make that maybe you sneak that creature out, give your creature first strike, block a creature, kill the creature in the process. You can -1 get a 2/2 Samurai token with Vigilance so that it can attack and doesn't have to tap. And on top of that, its -2 ability is just exile target tap creature, you gain 2 life. So your opponent attacks in, you exile that creature, you gain 2 life, and essentially whatever big threat they may have had now gets eliminated by a Planeswalker that, usually is typically face up on the battlefield, so you know what's coming. So if you see your opponent have double white and 2 other lands open, there's a possibility that there is a Wandering Emperor in their hand. They're just waiting for the right moment to play it. So it is, yet again, it's gonna be one of those frustrating cards because typically, like I said, it's a card that you see face up when you're playing it. It has a lot of good value. I do think a Planeswalker having Flash is definitely very good, and having Flash plus these abilities, I think it makes it that much better. And it's a card that fits in a lot of decks as well, right? So if you're an aggro deck that plays white, you can see this card in it because it's very good there. If you're a control deck, this is another good card because this card not only kind of exiles creatures, it makes tokens, and on top of that, it gives those tokens now +1/+1. So yet again, a card that has very good value, very good versatility. Even at the cost of double white, I think you'll see a lot of play in decks that play white regardless of what that deck is, just because I do think there's a lot of decent mana fix that you can probably cast that double white. And it's just a very good card. I think it's probably one of the better Planeswalkers that we'll see post-rotation. Not saying that it's the best Planeswalker, but I would say it's probably in the top, 3, I would say at least, if not at the top, depending on who you are and what kind of how you judge it. Like I said, it's probably a really good Planeswalker. In general, we don't know what Planeswalkers will pop up in the meta post-rotation, but for now, this is kind of one of the better Planeswalkers that will still be around in a post-rotation standard. And the last card up is a card that I feel like it's on everyone's list. It's definitely a very, very frustrating card, and that card is going to be the Meathook Massacre. This enchantment, it's a legendary enchantment. It does cost double black and then X. But the reason why it's so good of a card is that it has initial value when it comes down to the battlefield. And then on top of that, it has value after the initial ability goes away. So one, it's not a destroy all creatures, it's give all creatures -X/-X, which gets around things like indestructibility, so that makes it good there. And then on top of that, every time a creature you control dies, you drain your opponent for 1 life. Every time a creature your opponent controls dies, you gain 1 life. So it's a card that like can, you know, sweep the board, gain you a bunch of life, drain your opponent a bunch of life, and on top of that, that ability is going to be there for the rest of the game unless your opponent can figure out a way to, you know, get rid of the Meat Hook Massacre. But typically, people who play this card are people who have 3 more copies in their deck, so it's a card that they'll probably cast another time, if not multiple more times throughout the game. And then to kind of combine that and a lot of the mono black control decks that currently exist in the format, this card's in there. I think it's in most decks that play black in general, as it is a very good removal. Just because -X/-X removal is a lot better than destroy removal, just because of the ability it evades, you know, those indestructible kind of like things. It is a very good card. It is definitely a reason why the card's so valuable, because it's just that good. You know, I think there was talks even back to last year that people were like wondering if this card would get banned. You know, it's one of those things we'll have to kind of wait and see, and kind of see what other removal kind of pops up. But there's a possibility that you could see, you know, Wizards kind of maybe ban this kind of at some point in the next year or so, if it becomes that much of a problematic card that it kind of eliminates other deck types from really working out. But yet again, you know, it's one of those things. It's another card that has been nerfed on the alchemy side, because I guess they saw that it had too much value. So it's definitely, you know, a card that is problematic. It is a card that, if you see your opponent playing black and they have mana open, but they haven't really done much, they may be calculating what they're kind of waiting for you to kind of feed the board, and then they're just going to wipe that board out. So it's definitely a very, very good card. And it's definitely going to be a problematic card too, just because I do think it's probably one of the best removal spells currently in Standard, and it will still probably be one of the best removal spells or board removal spells in the next Standard. So definitely a card that really makes the list. And just like everything here, yet again, I'm speculating. You know, it's possible once we kind of see the meta develop, as we get, you know, not just Dominaria United, but we get the Brothers War, and then whatever set comes out next year. It's definitely one of those things that some of these cards will probably be still at the top of the meta. There'll be other cards that may fall out of this list, you know, when, you know, those cards get introduced and kind of the meta develops a little bit more. But like I said, you know, it's going to be kind of interesting to kind of see how my list changes next year when you know, these cards will be leaving Standard. So it's definitely one of those things to kind of get an idea of, you know, maybe cards that will become problems initially in the meta. But yet again, I can't wait to kind of see this list and kind of see how my list next year kind of, you know, incorporates any of these cards in that list. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. Are there cards that maybe I didn't put here in my list that, you know, you feel like will be problematic? You know, it's definitely one of those things I always like to hear what you guys think when it comes to cards. You know, yet again, you know, this is not like a list for the most part that I think these cards are in this particular order, like straight up. It's all my opinion. So, you know, I definitely have different opinions than other people. But if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, you want to know I post new videos on the channel like this one, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next video. Just want to give a special shout out to the channel members here on my YouTube channel. You can also become a channel member yourself down below the video, hitting that join button. It definitely helps out a lot, and I just appreciate you guys for your support.